Okay. Hello and welcome to our Small Talk Summer Series. I'm Leilani Lynch, curator at the Bass, and Small Talks are a chance to get to know more about artists featured at the museum, what they're working on, and what's inspiring them this summer. At the end of the conversation, we'll be taking some questions from the audience, so feel free to pop any questions that you might have in the chat feature. And I need to mention that Small Talks is made possible by generous support from Art Bridges, which we really appreciate. Thank you. And without further ado, today I'm pleased to join Naama Tsabar as our guest. Welcome, Naama. Hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and excited to jump in and talk a little bit more about your work. But first, I'm going to do a brief intro, if you don't mind. So Naama Tsabar was born in Israel and lives and works in New York. She received an MFA from Columbia University and has had solo exhibitions and performances presented at the Guggenheim Museum, Highline in New York, Nasher in North Carolina, Kunsthaus Baselland, Palais de Tokyo, Prospect New Orleans, CCA Tel Aviv, among many, many others. And she is currently part of a group exhibition called Fantasy America at the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, where she's tuning in from. And I'm so thrilled to be working on an exhibition with her, called Perimeters, which will be opening at the Bass this fall. So everyone stay tuned for that. So,
Exciting.
Naama, you're in Pittsburgh. Can you share what
I
you're
am.
doing there?
Yeah, so I am here for a performance. I'm, as you mentioned, part of the group exhibition Fantasy America, and I have a video in this show that is called Stranger. It's a video of an activation of one of my sculptures that's called Untitled Double Face, which is this chrome guitar that's doubled to become an instrument for two people to share. And I'm here to perform live.
Cool.
The work from the video, and the exciting thing, and perhaps the nerve-wracking thing is that it's my first performance in almost 2 years since the pandemic. Yeah, so it's back to the water.
Yeah, back into that. Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a good place to start because, for those out there who might be just learning more about your work, one of the things that I think is great is that it sort of spans and lives between different genres like, sculpture and installation, video, sound works, performance, even like painting. And so I'm curious about how you first approached art making. Like, how did it start for you? Was it through the music avenue? Was it performance? Was it visual art?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, from a very early age, my first love was music. It was a very immediate place for me from an early age to find a space where I could fantasize and kind of like have within my own borders of my own room kind of a world that's bigger and grander and perhaps broader than the limits of my own walls. But shortly after, or even just a bit before, I was very interested in art through kind of like a family connection that my father and grandfather were both painters as a hobby. And it was very much something that I grew up with, art. And as I came to my teens, I kind of dove really head into it and found that is perhaps not my first love, but it is my big love. And right after high school, I just knew that, this is what I wanted to do. And then I went into undergrad in Israel. I was 19 at the time. It was the early 2000s, and coinciding with my art school practice, 4 years at art school, I started playing in bands in Tel Aviv and performing. And so very immediately and organically, as the two just became weaved and fused together. And for my thesis show, it was already an installation that had both elements in it. And I think for me, it was really interesting. I love the creating and the studio and the making, but the nice thing, other than the sonic aspect, which is like a whole conversation within itself, is the ability for something to be kind of like have a life beyond the studio, have a life within an exhibition realm, within a public sphere, and change in a way that I perhaps could not control completely. And I think that's an exciting place for me. So the two marrying together is very much made sense in that on that front.
Yeah, and I think one of I think you're pretty well known for your works that are sort of have these sonic musical possibilities that people can maybe interact with. But maybe this is a good point to start talking about and bring up the images of some of your earlier work, which actually aren't. They kind of like negate that possibility of use. Can you talk a little bit more about this piece, Encore?
Sure. So Encore is my first, was the piece I did in 2007, as it says, is one of my first solo exhibition with a commercial gallery that represents me until today, the Dvir Gallery in Tel Aviv. And I think for me, the first steps were kind of like, they are very much rooted in the performative and the sonic. Through my studies, through my early 20s until my really early 30s, I was immersed in kind of nightlife environment, both bartending for a living and playing in bands. And so I got to see a lot of the backstage of these kind of environments and the kind of materials and the labor that facilitates an experience in such environments. And so specifically for Encore, I was interested in this very, very kind of fundamental material that you find in music stages, you find it, on films and in many places, but you never pay attention to it. It's something that's supposed to be hidden, and that's the gaffer tape. For this work, I had a whole stage set up in my studio, and so the gaffer tape is usually used to kind of stabilize chords on stage, so the musicians don't trip over them. And so with the stage that I had, the whole like instrument, everything hooked up in my studio, I started kind of stabilizing the cables, but that action, I kind of like extended it more and more and more, hence also the name of the work, Encore, which is like, the needing and wanting more at the end of the performance, but kind of like this more and more and more became a sort of cocooning of the whole stage itself and creating these kind of sculptural forms that kind of render the tape into the show itself in a way, from the place of the labor, the unseen, it kind of flips and turns into being kind of like the surface itself, the reflector of light. For this specific show, it was also the first time I worked with a lighting designer, so understanding very fast that maybe I'm working within the constraints of a gallery, a commercial gallery. They have, specific lighting, but even with that, this material really calls on reflection, on reflecting light. And so I work with Yael Vardi, which is a lighting designer from Israel that I've worked on many exhibitions with. And we kind of created this lighting of the work where there is it's perhaps hard to see in the images, but as you walk around the work, the light kind of shifts and sways in relation to kind of one surface reflecting an angle in your position. And so we were really kind of trying to enhance and play with the reflective nature of this specific gaffer tape. And just as a side note, or maybe it's not so much side note, technically, sculpturally, this whole work is completely empty. And so it's just the shell of the stage. And for that reason, I also kind of chose to hang it from the ceiling. It's something that looks really dense and heavy and like almost like bronze, but it's actually light and it's a cocoon. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the cocoon. Your word cocoon, because it does like bring up that idea of kind of care. Like usually the gaffer tape are meant to just like protect and kind of like not really be visible, but they have that quality. But is that also the case for the other? I think there's a next work that shows a microphone. Is that also empty, or is there an actual microphone in there?
Yeah, those are reliefs. Those are reliefs, microphone reliefs. This is like 7 years later, so it's a bit of a later work. Continuing to use the gaffer tape in my work as a material. I started doing these stage reliefs, and actually there's one in Miami with this fantastic band called Cave of Swimmers, and what I don't know if Churchill still exists, but in Churchill's, they performed in Churchill's. This was 2013, and after the performance, I went on stage and I stabilized all the cords and cables exactly the way they were the minute the show was over. So no instruments, but rather just the cables. And I took that to the studio and made this relief that was a gaffer's relief of the moment the show was over. So it was the size of the stage, and the composition was not something that I could control. It was something that had to do with where they stood on stage and their kind of movement within that specific frame. And so the only thing I kind of like chose is the way I laid the gaffer. Would it be straight? Would it go straight into the side? And, choosing the band, which is like kind of like the first thing that you do is like, it's like choosing a CD to buy, if you're like a teenager and in the 90s. And the last thing is kind of like the artistic kind of language of like how the formal language of the tape. And this work, for example, is kind of like the smaller studies that I made in my studio to understand kind of like the potential of those moments. So this is these are studies for a microphone. So it's microphone and cables.
Yeah, exactly, I love this one that comes off the wall, and it actually leads into the another work which we're looking at in terms of for our show at the Bass, but this one really not to give away too much, that'll be the only hint I give away. Okay. But this one, instead of a kind of a smaller study, it really kind of becomes the architecture of the space, and you can't almost, unlike the other works, I feel like you can't really tell that it is gaffer tape. Maybe that's just the photograph, but it almost becomes paint on the wall.
Yeah, it does. I think it kind of transcends kind of to the architectural and to the kind of like painterly almost. Like if you think of like kind of like diffused Rothkos or something, in black, and it is really just the kind of like the play with light. It's so wonderful with these tapes. I always think, this is actually the first work I ever did with gaffer tape. It's from 2006. This iteration that you're showing right now is actually a later iteration that's, I think, from 2016. They're always site-specific, these kind of like architectural gaffer walls. But I almost think of them as like they're between painting, architecture, and they're also kind of like a 99-cent Syrah, Like there is something of the tarry about it, and kind of like the depth of the black and the action of adhering it to the wall. And so they're in this in between zone, but for me they're also kind of like this night veil, this kind of transitional space that is is embedded in a bigger space, that it leads you through something to something.
And I imagine that they also, with that amount of tape, it also affects kind of the acoustics of the space too, or not really?
Not really.
I mean, not really. Okay.
Maybe you know what? I mean, maybe. I mean, this show specifically, and the prior and to the show from 2006 where I originally showed it didn't have so much like a sonic live factor. So maybe, I don't know. Maybe it will. And that's going to be interesting actually, and we might find out. But also the other thing that might make that it probably would be kind of localized around the wall, and it also has to do with the curve, and a curve always kind of reflects sound differently.
Right.
So I think those two together might at least be like a mental space where sound sounds different. I don't know.
Yeah. I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
I mean, and then so moving to another another work, which is actually we're excited to have in the museum's collection,
Yeah.
which is called Transition 2021. This one sort of really has this functionality, right? With it is a functioning amplifier that you've kind of broken down and reconfigured, but it also has a very specific aesthetic that recalls, various art historical traditions. And I'm curious about how you kind of balance having your work be functional and usable with a very what seems to be intentional and specific aesthetic that you bring to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's, they're a call transition for that reason, these works. They are truly like transition works. As you mentioned, these are disassembled and reassembled amplifiers, and specifically, this is a Fender amplifier. And for me, it's interesting for the work, for these works, a lot of my works have strings on them and elements like that, this work is more so kind of like a platform for something to be heard through. So it's not something that you would touch necessarily as a visitor to the museum. However, it has the potential to be hooked up to something. And so since it's a disassembled and reassembled amplifier with all the wires that are running on the front of it that looks like, compositions and lines and knobs, those are completely functional and still connecting to the board in the back and the speaker. This kind of sculptural painting has the ability to emit sound and to be played through and heard. And so the question here is like, and I think we had this conversation as well, is like, what do you commit and hook up to it? It's a platform. It's almost like a curatorial platform. For me, many times I use it within kind of like the bigger logic of an installation, where it gets connected to another work that you hear through it. But I'm also interested in this open question of inserting content into it. And with that, I always think about this place where the work is, again, kind of like not in my control completely. And that's also a reason, when they're shown and it's not me choosing the content that goes into them, I like there to be some mention of it, because it's kind of like almost like collaboration that can go on and on and on through kind of like curatorial practice and hands, and so for me, that kind of tension of something that is a sculpture, is a painting, is on the wall, has a composition and is linked to kind of like art historical kind of references, but at the same time can completely still obtain its prior functionality. And that tension where it could be both, and it could, for some people it's more this, for some people it's more that. For me, it's both, and they both carry the same importance. And that's an interesting place for me that I think is very much kind of like a line that runs through a lot of my work.
Yeah, and we are, as we did talk about a couple weeks ago, that we are actually adding a microphone, so visitors to the museum will be able to see the work soon and be able to speak into a microphone that is then amplified out through the transition work, which really breaks with a lot of the assumed behaviors that need to happen in a museum, which is great. And I guess that also brings to the next body of work, which also has to do with kind of like dismantling, but in this case, it's really like just destructing and rebuilding again, which seems to be something, like you said, that kind of runs through the work. Can you tell a little bit more about Melodies of Certain Damage and sort of what goes into making it, and kind of the symbolism or kind of the weight of what that means in terms of the action of making it?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this work, Melodies of Certain Damage, is a series of works that I started making in 2018, I believe, or late 17. And they start off as just guitars that I order to my studio. I tune the guitars and then I break them. And the breaking act is not like the breaking act is not like a performative act. It's something I do privately in my studio. It's not about that moment per se. The work kind of starts after the break, and so the way the specific guitar breaks, the way the pieces scatter and break, I map that out. And so with these works, every time a certain melody of certain damage is installed, it is installed exactly the same way it broke. And so they kind of like hook up to the floor, they're installed the way they broke. And then, the interesting thing for me was to kind of reinsert them into a working order. Like, so that's why I say this work starts kind of after the break. Historically, the breaking of the guitar is kind of the cathartic moment of a performance. It's like a very gendered moment within rock and roll history. It's a violent moment. And for me, it's interesting to start with that object after that moment and think where it could go. And so these works imagine that by reinserting kind of sets of strings onto these broken pieces and microphones and reinserting them in kind of an instrumental order that works. But, of course, a guitar is an object. It's something you hold, you contain. And with these works, once they kind of explode and kind of like break, they become kind of almost like places for you to insert your body if you want to activate the works. And that is kind of like just reshuffles the whole idea of how do you activate them, how do you perform, what is your position when you perform on them. And indeed, when I showed them in different institutions and groupings of them, they're on the floor always. And my big question was working with performers was like, how do we insert ourselves into these breaks, into these pieces on the floor, into a performative moment that is kind of like flat on the floor most of the time, from a place of power, from a place that's not like a place of a compromised position or not a place of weakness, and that is something that's the first kind of question that we start when we start kind of collaborating and writing these performances.
Oh, I was just going to ask, since you were talking about the performances, if you could say a little bit more. I know that you, in all or most of your performances, you work with women or female identified performers and non-binary folks. And maybe you can just say a little bit more about the process of also collaborating and kind of building, because it's not something you come to with a plan in your head. It's something you build together, right?
Yeah. The works are completely, the performance are collaborations. In a way, I am kind of the editor, so every time I show a grouping of works that is interactive and has the potential to be kind of composed on and learned and mastered, I bring together local musicians usually. As you said, female identifying, gender non-conforming. For me, that's super important within kind of the trajectory and history that I'm writing for the works. Thinking about kind of like the gendered history of mastery within instruments and music, and trying to kind of like think of these as new instruments or potential instruments, and having the history for them be written, writing a history for them that is, that is feminist, that is of a different kind of like gender. And so, when I start working, putting together the group of musicians, we go through kind of what I consider to be almost like a workshop. So 7 days, for example, and those 7 days are rehearsals, but they're also the time that we are writing the piece. And so it starts from sheer play and kind of experimentation into revisiting it. I work with cameras, and I kind of document the whole process. And then I give exercises to the musicians. So they react to the exercise, and I document it. And then like after 2 days, I have kind of an explosion of material. And then from that kind of, I find the places that I feel are strong. And then I go back to the group and say, look at these things. How can we elaborate? How can we make them grow? And the nice thing is for me, you know, I selfishly get to be an audience still.
Mm.
And I get to be, you know, I have input, but each musician brings their own set of skills, their own background, and their own kind of way of moving. And so I get to work with other people that bring a lot to the work that I couldn't bring myself. And in that sense, it's a complete collaboration. And at the end, we really come to like a composition that is a sort of score that we then reperform.
Yeah, and I think we have a video that kind of gives us an idea of how this manifests after the process. So maybe it's a good point to show that clip. Well, that was a different video, but actually, but that's okay. I mean, well, if we have the other one, maybe we play it, but it actually leads into the next set of works that we were going to get into anyway, so that's all right. Which, you know, it's not just with melodies of certain damage that you do this performative process. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about these kind of newer works, which started maybe with Closer and then went into the inversions, where you do have the opportunity to use them, but also in a different way that kind of goes beyond the floor, goes beyond the wall, into the architecture.
Yeah. So what we saw is indeed a different work, and it is from an installation that took place in Shulamit Nazarian Gallery in LA, and actually was one of my last performances in 2020, February 2020. And in that show, I highlighted kind of like just like an emerging body of work for me that is now kind of like really on my mind, which is called Inversions. And as you mentioned, kind of like the going back maybe to the first work that really directly relates to that is Closer. Closer is a work that is architecture itself. So it's a work that was made for a show I had in the Guggenheim in 2014, and it's basically a corner. It's a corner that connects to nothing. So it's two walls coming together to form a corner that is freestanding and does not support any other architecture but its own self. And so when the viewers come into the space, they indeed see a corner from the corner side of it, from the outside of it. But this corner has kind of two microphones that penetrate it, and those are kind of like a suggestion of what might happen on the other end, or what kind of usability it might have. When you turn this corner, this floating corner, you see the inside of the corner that has these kind of holes in them, and these holes, looking further into them, you can see that the inside is kind of painted red, and there's all these like instruments, kind of materials like guitar tuners and things like that. And this corner is basically one side of the wall that has like a set of inverted strings inside. And the other side is kind of a singing hole where you can sing into the corner, which renders the whole interior of the architecture, this floating corner, into a sandbox. So thinking about the interiors, and how the exterior and the interior come together and react to each other. And just even thinking about interiors, period, which is something that we have around us all the time that we don't pay that much attention to, the structures that hold and reverberate through space silently, invisibly. And so this is kind of like, this work closer is a sort of like a singer, I call it a singer-songwriter corner. A person would be standing in the corner. If they wanted to activate the work, they would be penetrating into one of the walls, playing the strings. They can sing into the other wall, and the microphones from the other end that are penetrating the wall are picking up everything that's this acoustic space and kind of like outputting it in a set of speakers. And so it also creates kind of like a really interesting kind of tension space of a performance, because in a way you're in a corner, you're facing the wall, you're hearing your own reflection. It's very intimate, you're not seeing anybody, or it's a very intimate private moment, but at the same time the microphones pick you up and you are also in a completely performative moment,
right?
So it's this doubling. So that kind of like was the source, the jumping pad for the inversion work, which deal with a lot of the same kind of like, subjects and themes. They extend into the actual architecture of the space. So no longer is this an object. The inversions are holes and boxes that are inserted into existing architecture.
Right.
And so they call upon the space behind the whole, the interiors of the whole wall around us, the thing that is around us, and the space behind that, as a space as a performative space, as a place of meaning, of belief, of whatever you want to kind of like infuse into it. And that too, these two have kind of like, this idea of facing a wall and performing, or privately, but being completely public at the same time. Also for me, I was thinking about, what does it mean to plug into the wall, kind of like almost like having like, it's a sort of hints of maybe sci-fi or something that is kind of like, that is, Cronenbergy, almost. This is on the right, you see a singing inversion. It's fashioned kind of like an old microphone, but it's also a bit like lungs, funny enough, just before COVID. And then on the left is a transition that's amplifying. So this is a pre-existing corner in a space, but you would sing into one side, and then another work, the transition would be outputting the audio, the outcome of, of the sonic outcome of you kind of outputting your words, your singing, your whispers, whatever they may be, into the walls.
Yeah, and so we saw the video of the performers and some images working with the artworks, but you also kind of leave that possibility open for viewers, for visitors to the museum or a gallery, and that also has its own kind of sense of giving them access or agency to do something that they wouldn't necessarily get to do with a more stagnant work of art. But what kind of brought you to extend that, or how did that enter your thinking in terms of making the works of extending that agency to an audience?
Yeah, it's kind of funny to ask an artist that. I feel like it's like all we do is touch things and mold and form them. That's all we want to do,
Right.
It's like, why then do we deny that of people? I don't know.
Yeah. Especially when they're so beautiful.
And don't give them that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me just touch this. This is just mine. No, but I'm half kidding, but not really. I think like there's something that I kind of touched upon, about the idea of like things happening in the space, and then an outcome is a sculpture, for example, a painting, whatever, and then that goes into an exhibition space, and then it's kind of like almost like a body, kind of like a corpse, if you want to be really kind of like harsh with it. And for me, the activation, the interactivity, which is a word that I resisted for many years, but now I completely own it. It's interactive. That aspect of the work is a continuation of what happens in the studio, and a way for the work to kind of live further beyond the studio, and have an experience beyond my own kind of molding and forming of it and conceptualizing of it. And so that place, for me is I think super interesting, where the work can live further, and it's not just like a representation of an action that took place somewhere else. And yeah, I think it's a great gift to be able to kind of be sensual and touch. And I know the past year and a half we have all been lacking this, and this is part of the human nature. This is one of our senses. So why I feel like if I couldn't kind of infuse that in the work, in the space, and allow, I will always try and do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're like you said, many of us have been like starved for it, interaction with other people, and just kind of like physical touch has become almost like unfamiliar as we are in quarantine, etc. So it really does. And we were talking about kind of like mastery before, and I think it's interesting to kind of give that ability to just a normal person visiting a museum or a gallery space, the ability to really try and learn to play something on an instrument that doesn't quite look like one that's very familiar.
Yeah, and also feel how a work feels. It's like, I mean, how many times did you want to really feel a work?
Exactly.
And understand that you weren't allowed to, or you had to do it. Under the cover of some cover. Anyways,
in a covert way. But yeah, I mean, that also brings up the felt works that we see in this picture. I realize we didn't touch on those, but those are very sensual in a way that you are actually rubbing your hands against the felt, right? To make them work.
Yeah. Those works are they're amplified through. So they come, they start off flat, and the tension is put on them with a piano string that's stretched on them with a set of tuners, the specific one we're looking at, and that gives them their shape. But there's a correlation kind of between the shape and the note or the pitch, because the more it's tension, the higher the note. And so these are kind of like really sculptures turned instruments, if they're activated, and they're amplified through a set of, they're picked up through a set of contact mics, which are these mics that are used in acoustic instruments. These are mics that actually amplify vibration through the surface. And so, as you say, you can even just touch the felt and you will be heard. It's almost like you would go to like Via Beacon and you would touch like a boy's felt, and all of a sudden there'll be like a big sound and everybody would be like, don't touch it, So, but here nobody tells you not to touch it. You're rewarded with sound. And then you, of course, can also, pluck the strings, and the strings make notes that are then kind of like amplified through guitar amplifiers. And with these works, they're really, you can really interact with them as a viewer. As performers, we really, they're flexible, so you can extend the string or contract it in a way that will change the pitch, change a note, and control it through your body, through interaction. And for me, the central aspects of the work and the interaction, whether it be performative and kind of like written, or kind of like a more spontaneous viewer object relationship, those moments are super interesting for me. And this is the way I experience the work, through a sensual kind of platform, and that makes sense that the work the sculptures kind of like extend that into the exhibition space for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about how these are like sculptures turned instruments, and it just reminds me of I think the next work that we had, which is a more recent project you've done, where it's almost like an instrument turned into a sculpture. If we can go to the next slide, yes, which is a highlight.
Yeah, I was like, what is it?
Yeah, can you talk about this? And also, it's a work in outdoors in public space. So I'm curious to hear about that process.
Yeah, it's my first outdoor sculpture. I'm super excited about it. It's currently on the Highline until March 2022. And for this work, I was thinking about, well, in 2017, I'll just start from the start. In 2017, I went down to New Orleans to do a site visit for Prospect. And that was exactly the time after quite a few Confederate statues have been removed from the public realm, from their plinths. And these plinths were left empty. And I was staying in this hotel that was overlooking Lee Circle, which was used to be General Lee, on a big phallic plinth. And so I was just staring at this empty plinth pedestal, outside. And that was, I think, was a really interesting space to think about. And, I know we all think about that space quite a lot right now, but it's that space that's left empty, but still represents, history, but also the change of history. And so for the work in the Highline, I kind of fused a metronome, a piano metronome, which is the keeper of time, what you would play to and practice to if you're trying to be on time, with kind of like this abstracted kind of plinth from granite. And so it's an empty pedestal that is also a working metronome that keeps time. And so it's kind of like fusing these two impossible objects together, where it's something that we consider historical and kind of like eternal and set in stone, quite literally, and something that keeps time and shows you the movement of time. It's circular time, but also kind of I changed the writing on the metronome plate. Usually it's time signature in Italian. And here I kind of changed it to 3 words, which is then, THEN, now, and then, which are, then is interesting because it both can be past and present. And then now, of course, is the only thing that exists that is, not within that circle. And so it's very much for me a work about the way, what's happening right now politically, but also kind of the way time is moving through it, and things and our perspective change, and history itself changes, and how it is related to time and a certain perspective. And it has a sound, of course, of the metronome, the ticking.
And is it what's the beats per minute, or what is the kind of rate that it's moving
BPM?
at? Yeah.
Yeah, it's moving at around 60.
And does that play all day, or does it turn off?
Turns off when the Highline closes.
Oh, right.
It has like a and 60 is like, I was thinking, when I first thought of this work, it was supposed to be last year before the pandemic, and I thought, well, it's New York, and this has to have like a really high time signature, a fast one, and then everything that happened, and like then slowness and time moving slower just made so much more sense to the way we live. But also thinking about kind of a human heartbeat, usually at rest for like a healthy adult, but not an athlete, is between 60 and 100. And so I thought that's kind of a nice place to start, thinking of our own heartbeat and its rhythm.
That's so interesting that as you were reflecting, like over the year, that when it was supposed to happen versus when it did happen, that you ended up changing the rhythm, because I think we talk about that a lot in just like all aspects of our lives, of kind of like needing to slow down more and wanting to maintain that rhythm, which
Yes.
This really encapsulates.
Yes, and it's a place of presence as well. The last year and a half, that place of presence was also a place of horror and a place of anxiety, and many things. But it is still a place where you are present. In the moment. And so I think there's also kind of something within me that is kind of wanting to hold on to that.
Mm. Well, I'm looking to see if we have any questions. If we don't have any yet, please feel free to add them in the chat or not. I do have another question, just kind of continuing on a reflection of the times and sort of being in the moment. Is there anything that you are sort of reading, watching, consuming, doing now these days that's inspiring you or bringing you joy?
I'm consuming a lot. But mostly music and books, to be honest. I've been really into this whole and going into this whole of Octavia Butler books, to be honest, which surprised me because I'm not like a big sci-fi book fan. But she's just so brilliant the way she writes, and specifically, I think I relate to kind of like this place of the body and the body kind of having extraterrestrial powers, or kind of like these things that. But also there's places of architecture and body fusing together, which I feel like really with my inversion work has like a lot of like kind of places where I can see the relationship. And it's just such like fantastic writing in terms of like holding a place for sci-fi, but also a critical, political, racial kind of critique, and a dystopian one, as well, that is showing us 20 years back, what we're going through right now. So quite potent and precise as well. So that's something I'm reading. I'm literally just like going through
All of them.
all of them. Yeah, I think that's kind of like, that's something that I'm really, a set of books that I'm really, really kind of diving into these days.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think books are a great place to just kind of find comfort and to kind of go to different worlds. And sci-fi sounds like an interesting place to be going in terms of where your mind's at. So I totally understand. Well, great. I don't see any questions in the chat. I guess people are shy, but that's actually a good place to wrap up, I think. So I want to thank you, Naama, for joining me for this conversation. I know that you have to get back to rehearsal after this, or sound check, and good luck with your performance. And thanks to all who tuned in, and thanks again to Art Bridges for supporting the program. And we hope to see you at the Bath soon. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Leilani.
Talk soon.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.